Is climate change real? That's the question I've been asking my students in the last couple of days, and all of them says yes, it exists. And I looked outside and I told them, well, the environment is the same that I've seen the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the last 50 years. So how can you say there's climate change if nothing has changed outside? So this is the premise of what I was asking my students this week. And this was an activity of critical thinking skills. And at the end, I did not want to tell them if there was climate change or not. I wanted to give them all kind of information, all the information I could think of so that they could reinforce their beliefs. So I did not want to tell them what to think, and that's not always easy. So, welcome to this podcast. My name is Alain Faber. I've been teaching science for more than 25 years, and I'm sharing some ideas about my experiences, what I go through in my classroom, my ideas, and these are what I believe. If you have any questions or clarification questions as we progress, put your comments in the section below, and I'm always willing to see what we can discuss. Usually, the way it goes, the podcast is divided in three parts. One is about the learner's perspective, the other one, the teacher's perspective, and the third one is about the leader's perspective, and we'll see how things are going tonight. So, is there climate change right now? Is it real or is it a myth? That's a good question. Nowadays, students do, if you look at the literature, they say that teenagers a lot of them are suffering from eco-anxiety. They are worried about the environment, ecosystems, but sometimes they are worried, but worried because of what is being said. So I just did talk with them today. Let's see what information do we have about climate. So we've been working about ecosystems. In the last couple of days, we've talked about the water cycle. So if you don't know about the water cycle, it's when we have an energy source, the sun. It takes the water from, for example, a body of water, a lake. There's evaporation, condensation when the vapor goes up into the sky, condensation, then precipitation, and the cycle goes on. On top of that, we've talked about photosynthesis and the use of carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, but also production of carbon dioxide in organisms like us humans when we are breathing. And we're talking about the fact that in the carbon cycle, we have an ongoing balance between photosynthesis and cellular respirations of living organisms. However, humans are using fossil fuels to be able to have the energy to modify their environment. So what happens here, there's an imbalance with how energy is being used and how carbon dioxide is being used as well. Now, we're talking about carbon dioxide right now, and I'm going to go with other greenhouse gases as we go along. And the big question I had today was, okay, is there any climate change? And many of them, they told me, yes, there's climate change. But when I asked them, how did they know? All they could say was the fact that they had heard about it, they had seen videos, social media was there. So I told them, let's see what kind of information we can find. So the first thing I talked to them is the fact that when we are thinking of climate, climate is always an average temperature, an average humidity over several decades that makes an area specific with its ecosystems. So, for example, we are in a temperate forest environment at home here. And why? It rarely goes on average below -5 degrees Celsius in the winter, and the average in the summer is about 22 degrees Celsius. We have 4 seasons, and the cycle has been going on for centuries. So this is something that is stable. The other thing that we talked about is the fact that in the last few years, there's been a situation where we've had some weather changes here and there that have affected humans all around the world. So we talked about the fact that climate is an average condition over several decades that creates an environment for plants and agriculture and human settlement. What happens though is that when you think of weather, which is a much shorter time span, weather has been going pretty much haywire over the last couple of years. So here in Canada, 2 years ago, lots of forest fires in the summer. We also had forest fire in the last summer. We had a town, Banff, that was half of it was decimated by fire. We've had plenty. We had flash flooding in during the summer because we had thunderstorms going on and inundations everywhere. We've had situation where in the United States, in Texas, we've got snow and icing and ice rain. Crazy environment where in the past it was usually always a fairly warm winter, and now we have icy precipitation. Big difference there. If you think of in Europe, for example, in London, Paris, we've had some snow. Students they were telling me that even in Egypt, there's been some snow here and there, which doesn't happen very often. In the last couple summers, we've had heat waves here in Canada, in the United States as well. In South Asia, with like several days to several weeks with like 45 degrees Celsius in the shade, very, very hot. We've had monsoon in the Pacific and in the Asian areas. We've had hurricanes that seem to be bigger and bigger that have affected North America and Central America. So what happens here is we have weather patterns that are different as we go along. Now, when we think of climate, we are thinking of a stable environment where we can predict what more or less the average temperature and the average precipitation is. So climate is pretty easy. However, where I live, which is supposed to be a temperate forest, because of changes in temperature, we won't have palm trees growing next year. And the reason for that is the average temperature is still too cold for such a big drastic change in the environment. So the big question I ask my students is, okay, we know that we know what climates are, but we know that there are changes in how the weather patterns are, and let's see what is the cause of that. So I showed them the temperature, the average, the global temperature on a yearly graph, which was saying, so the idea here is that if you look at the average temperature in the 20th century from 1900 to 2000, we have an average temperature, and more or less it gives us a reference point. But what we've noticed though is that reference point was fairly even and stable between the 1930s and 1980s. However, since the 1980s, what has happened is that we've had global temperature, yearly global temperature rising a little bit. In the 1980s and in the 1990s, those rise of temperature, those yearly temperature were maybe 0.2 degrees, 0.4 degrees, which doesn't make a big difference. However, what I've showed the students is that those small increments, those increase on global temperature have been consistently growing and then getting higher and higher. So we have a trend that is going up and up. And last year, in 2023, we had the hottest recorded global temperature we had with an increase of about, it was 1.17 degrees Celsius compared to the average global temperature from the 20th century. So you say, well, 1.2 degrees is not a lot of degrees. That is true. And on top of that, it is the global average temperature on 1 year. So this is weather related. But if you think for the fact that if you look at the 20 years, so the 23 years of the 21st century, all of the temperature has been higher than the average temperature of the 20th century. So what happens here is that we have a pattern where we have an increase in global temperature. In that increase, even though it's been 0.2 degrees, 0.6 degrees, and last year almost 1.2 degrees Celsius, we're in a situation where this is creating spot difference in different places around the world. So we're not saying that the overall climates are changing, but here and there, weathers are changing, and it's not necessarily affecting the climate in those places, But globally, we have changes happening. And that's what we need to keep in mind. So, as we discussed, at the end, I mentioned to them, so do we have climate change or is it a myth? So, they were saying that yes, climates are changing because of the data we have, but it's not changing as a climate in one area. It's changing some of the global weather patterns around the world, and we have, let's see, how can I say that? They have extremes, and it's changing that quite a bit. And then we came to the discussion that those changes that are like a higher temperature one year, lower temperature, drought, inundations, what happens is that we're not quite ready or adapted for such fast changes. So when we think of climate change, we know that overall an average doesn't change, but it's much harder for us to adapt when things are happening very, very fast. And that was good because it came from them. And the whole idea here is that I looked outside, as I mentioned earlier, and I told them, well, there's no palm trees outside. Therefore, can I say that global climate change is not happening? They were saying, then they realized that it's not that climate change is not happening, but because there's some increase in temperature, local weathers are changing, and therefore it becomes more erratic, and therefore we cannot predict climate as the average that we used to think about in the 1930s, 1950s, and 1970s, because there's been an increase in overall temperature, and that made a difference, and that's interesting that way. So the question I have for them then is, okay, so should we be stressed about that, and what can we do about these events? And then they realize that it's much harder to see what we can do, especially that we cannot really predict where those weather extremes are happening. And the other one here is because these weather patterns are changing, our cities and infrastructures are set in one place. So if weather is changing, if the climate eventually changes, our cities cannot move as easily as weather patterns can. And that's a worry for some. If people are close to the ocean line, so they love to be close to the beach in Florida, New York City, some places in South Asia as well. People like to be close to the water. But if there's an increase in temperature and we have sea level rises, the difficulties we have is that it's much harder to move cities when we have a lot of infrastructure already set. And on top of that, if you think of vegetation, a forest cannot uproot themselves and walk north for 10 or 15 kilometers every year to try to adapt for change in weather. That's tricky. And that's why when we say that climates are changing, because in one place, but when we used there was plenty of water and a good average temperature, then we end up with times where there are droughts for several years, maybe a decade. I was writing with someone from the audience, and we're seeing that in Namibia, there's been a drought for the last 10 years. In Canada, one of the reasons we have so many forest fires is that we've had rain, that is true. However, it's been so much warmer and a bit less rain. So what happened here is that in the forest, the soil and the ground, they're much drier than they used to be. And because they're much drier, when the fire starts, it's so much easier for it to spread because the humidity in the ground is not there as it used to be 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And why? Just a little change in temperature increases the evaporation and therefore drying the area. So even if we have similar precipitation, just the fact that it's a little bit warmer, it changes how forests are. In Toronto, and I've done a video on that one, in Toronto, we've had those flash flooding because of what was it called? It was a rainstorm. And on top of that, because we did not have the infrastructure to deal with so much water all at once, a lot of the sewage water was just crudely dealt with. But a lot of sewage water ended up in the lake, in the Ontario Lake, because we did not have the infrastructure to take care of so much water all at the same time. Because if you think in the area, maybe we have 70 to 80 millimeters of rain on average in July. But in this July, there was one time when we got about 10 centimeters, so 100 millimeter within a few hours. That was in July. And the same thing in August. So what happened here is that the infrastructure is just overloaded. So here, I did not tell my students if there was climate change or not, because I don't want to be in a situation where I tell them what is, but they cannot make up their minds as well. At the end, they have their own ideas, and I did question them on these ideas because what I want them to do is get the information and reinforce their beliefs. If they believe that there's climate change, they have now more tools to explain to others what they believe and why they do so. If they believe that there's no climate change, at least they can reinforce by some of the arguments that I've given. But as we are expanding the discussion, many of them could change their point of view because they had the data and not just a story by someone on social media, for example. Anyway, I think this was interesting. And the only thing you have to keep in mind, so for learners, it's always exciting because the ideas comes from them. But for the teacher's perspective, it's always unnerving because teachers always want to prepare lessons. We want to have a good idea where we're going. We want to make sure that everybody is included, but we also want to make sure that we move forward. The discussion I had in my class took about 2 days. I was hoping I could have told them in 15 minutes, here's the data, here's the information, and this is what I believe, and this is what will be on the test. It would have been so much easier. So it took about maybe 10 times more time. However, I do believe that critical thinking is a great part for the students. The more they can learn to think, the more they can bring good arguments to support their points. I think that's a skill that is good beyond my class, and it is a good skill for the future. So that was the activity that I did, and I hope that you can find good ideas in that story. And very good. And keeping in mind, so more and more students feel they have like eco-anxiety. And I was trying to figure out what it means, but also how can I give them the tools to say, okay, this is the current situation. Let's see if we can have, and that's what we'll do in the coming weeks. Can we have ideas on how we can improve the situation, minimize the issues, and try to see, okay, we all have brains and we can make great things. Let's see if we can do something better for our society. On this, I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop this right now, hoping that you had a good evening. Don't forget to give a chance to your students to have good questions to think about and use their critical thinking skills so that they can make up their own mind given good data. On this, have a wonderful evening, hoping that you will have something to think about. And if it happens, you have any comments, put them in the comments below. I'm always looking at them. If you have questions, I'm always willing to answer the questions as well. On this, I think it's time. I feel like I'm rambling again. Anyway, on this, have a good evening. I'll see you next week at 7:30 next Wednesday.